Hello and welcome to Whispered Ages, where ancient stories carry you gently into peaceful sleep. Before we begin our journey tonight, I'd love to connect with you, wherever you are in this vast world of ours. How has your day been? Perhaps it's been long and full of modern worries, or maybe quiet and contemplative. Whatever brought you here tonight, you're welcome. I'm curious, what time is it where you're listening? Are you settling in as evening shadows grow long? Or perhaps it's already deep night where you rest? And where in this beautiful world do you call home? Whether you're listening from a bustling city, a quiet countryside, or somewhere in between, we're connected now by this ancient tale that transcends all borders and centuries. If you're finding peace in these stories of forgotten worlds, I'd be grateful if you consider subscribing to Whispered Ages. Each story is crafted to carry you away from the rush of today and into the gentle embrace of history's most fascinating mysteries. Now let yourself settle comfortably, close your eyes if you wish, and let your breathing slow. Tonight, we journey to a land of stone fortresses and mountain mists, to a kingdom that once stood proud among the peaks, but now lives only in whispered legends and crumbling walls. Picture, if you will, a world wrapped in morning mist. The year is 850 before the birth of Christ, and the world is young in ways we can barely imagine. Here, in the highlands where three modern nations now meet, Turkey, Armenia and Iran, the air is thin and sharp with the scent of volcanic stone and wild herbs. Mount Ararat rises like a sleeping giant against the pearl-grey sky, its peak lost in clouds that have gathered there since the world was made. The mountain's shadow falls across a land of impossible beauty, deep blue lakes nestled between rocky peaks, valleys green with barley and wheat, and everywhere the patient work of human hands, carving life from stone. This is the realm of Urartu, though that name means little to you now. It meant everything once when the world was younger and empires rose and fell like seasons, long before Rome stretched its mighty arms across the Mediterranean, long before the glory that was Greece sent philosophers to ponder under olive trees. There was this mountain kingdom, strong and mysterious, carved into the cliffs, like a whisper from the gods themselves. Listen. In the early morning stillness, you can almost hear them, the voices of stonemasons tapping their chisels against volcanic rock, the splash of oars against the dark waters of Lake Van, the distant bleating of goats on terraced hillsides. The sound carries on the wind, mixing with the cry of eagles circling the peaks, weaving together into a song that speaks of permanence, of people who believed their kingdom would endure forever. But forever is a word that mountains understand better than men. The peaks of Ararat have watched 1,000 kingdoms rise from the valleys below, and they have watched them return to dust with the same patient indifference. Tonight, they will watch over you as well, as we walk together through the halls of memory, through corridors of stone that echo still with the footsteps of kings whose names are carved in languages we can barely read. Breathe deeply and let the mountain air fill your lungs. Feel the ancient stones beneath your feet, worn smooth by countless generations. The kingdom of Urartu awaits, and its story begins not with conquest or glory, but with the simple, eternal human desire to find safety among the peaks, to build something lasting in a world of change. Where others built empires with roads and gold, Urartu built in stone and silence. Their legacy sleeps now in the earth, but tonight, for you, it awakens. The year is 860 BCE, and the world trembles under the sandaled feet of Assyrian armies. From their great cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Assyrians march outward like a tide of bronze and iron, swallowing kingdoms, enslaving peoples, carrying away the gold and grain of conquered lands. Their king, Shalmaneser III, dreams of an empire that stretches from sea to sea, and his dreams have teeth. But here, in the Armenian highlands, the mountains themselves seem to resist. The peaks rise like the spine of some sleeping dragon, creating a natural fortress where different tribes have lived for generations beyond counting. These are not the soft river valleys of Mesopotamia, where armies can march in neat formations across flat ground. This is a land where every hill might hide an enemy, where every pass might become a trap, where the very stones seem to watch and judge. Among these watching stones, a king is rising. His name is Arame, and though history will remember him only faintly, he is the foundation upon which a great kingdom will be built. Picture him now, not young, for leadership comes to those who have survived the harsh lessons of the mountains, but still strong, with eyes that have learned to read the language of stone and sky. Arame stands on a high cliff overlooking Lake Van, that great body of water that stretches blue and endless between the peaks. The lake is ancient beyond measure, formed by volcanic forces that shaped this land when the world was still learning how to hold together. Its waters are alkaline and bitter to taste, but they teem with a fish found nowhere else on earth, and their shores provide salt that has been traded since men first learned to value things beyond mere survival. The tribes scattered around this lake, the Nairi peoples, as the Assyrians call them, have lived here for so long that they're part of the landscape itself. Each tribe has its own ways, its own gods carved from local stone, its own chief who traces his lineage back to heroes, whose deeds are remembered only in songs sung around winter fires. But Arame sees something these separate chiefs cannot. He sees that the Assyrian tide rising from the south will drown them all if they remain divided. And so, with words both gentle and firm, with offers of marriage between families and promises of shared prosperity, with displays of strength when words fail and wisdom when strength is not enough, Arame begins the patient work of binding these mountain peoples into something greater than the sum of their parts. It is not conquest in the Assyrian manner. There are no great battles, no cities burned, no slaves taken. Instead, it is the slow, careful construction of trust, stone by stone, like building a wall that will stand for centuries. The first great fortress of Urartu begins to rise during these early years, not as a monument to Arame's ego, but as a practical statement of unity. Tushpa, they call it, the city that will become the beating heart of the kingdom. It is built on a rocky peninsula that juts into Lake Van like a stone finger, pointing toward the centre of the world. The location is chosen with the careful eye of people who understand that in mountain warfare, height is life and water is survival. Watch now as the stones are cut from the living rock of the mountains. Eurasian masons, learning their craft from traditions passed down through generations, understand that volcanic stone is both blessing and challenge. It is hard enough to turn aside the finest bronze weapons, but it can be shaped by those who know its secrets. They cut blocks so perfectly fitted that no mortar is needed. Each stone locks with its neighbours, like the pieces of a great puzzle, creating walls that will stand when iron rusts and bronze turns green. The work is slow, as all lasting things must be. Each stone is placed with ceremony, blessed by priests who offer wine, and grain to Haldi, the god of war, and mountains who will become the protector of Urartu. Haldi is not like the distant gods of other peoples. He is immediate and present, standing atop his sacred lions, his strength flowing directly into the stones that guard his people. As Tushpa rises, so does the confidence of the mountain tribes. They see that united, they can build things that would be impossible alone. They see that their children might grow up in safety, that their harvest might feed their own families rather than Assyrian granaries, that their young men might defend their own hills, rather than die in foreign wars. But the Assyrians have not forgotten the mountains. Shalmaneser's armies probe northward, testing the strength of this new confederation. They burn outlying villages, carry away cattle and grain, leave behind the message that resistance is futile. Yet always, the mountains seem to swallow these expeditions. The Assyrians find that their tactics, so successful in the river valleys, work poorly in this vertical world of narrow passes and hidden valleys. Arame and his growing council of chiefs learn to fight a different kind of war, not the clash of armies in open fields, but the patient warfare of mountain people. They strike from high places and vanish into stone. They poison water sources and block mountain passes. They use the very geography of their homeland as a weapon, turning every peak into a watchtower, every valley into a potential trap. And slowly, grudgingly, the Assyrians begin to understand that this mountain kingdom will not be easily digested. The cost of conquering Urartu begins to outweigh the benefits. There are easier kingdoms to the west and north, peoples who will submit rather than disappear into stone and return like wolves in winter. During these formative years, something remarkable happens. The scattered dialects of the mountain tribes begin to merge into a common tongue, Urartian, a language unlike any other spoken in the ancient world. It borrows the cuneiform writing system from Mesopotamia, but the words it records are its own, carrying concepts and ideas born in the high places where eagles nest and snow never fully melts. The language becomes the kingdom's second foundation, as important as the stones of Tushpa. In Urartian, treaties are written and laws are carved. In Urartian, prayers are offered to Huldi, and stories are told of the kingdom's growing glory. In Urartian, the dreams of a mountain people find their voice. By the time Arame passes into the care of his ancestors, Urartu is no longer merely a confederation of tribes. It is a kingdom with its own identity, its own destiny, its own quiet confidence that it can stand against whatever storms the world might bring. The foundations are laid in stone, in language, in the shared understanding that these mountains are home to something worth defending. The work of generations stretches ahead, and the peaks of Ararat watch with ancient patience as a new chapter in the story of the world begins to unfold in the mists and shadows of the Armenian highlands. The morning sun catches the copper sheathing of Tushpa's great temple, sending rays of golden light dancing across the dark waters of Lake Van. It is the year 810 BCE, and Urartu has found its strength. Under the rule of King Menua, Arame's successor, the mountain kingdom no longer merely survives, it flourishes. Menua is a different kind of king than his predecessor. Where Arame was the careful builder of foundations, Menua is the architect of expansion. He stands on the high walls of Tushpa in the early dawn, watching the mist rise from the lake, and his mind encompasses not just the valleys he can see, but the vast territories beyond the mountains, where Urartu's influence might spread like water flowing downhill. Under Menua's rule, the kingdom's borders push outward in all directions. To the north, Urartian influence reaches toward the Caucasus Mountains, where fierce tribes are gradually brought into the kingdom's embrace through a mixture of diplomacy and demonstration of strength. To the south, Urartian forces probe into the upper reaches of Mesopotamia, establishing fortresses and trading posts that challenge Assyrian dominance in regions the great empire had considered secure. But it is to the west that Menua's greatest achievements lie. Here in the rugged terrain of eastern Anatolia, he establishes a network of fortress cities that will become the glory of Urartu. Each one is positioned with the careful eye of a people who understand that in mountain warfare, the high ground is everything. Each one is built with the patient skill of masons who know that stones properly placed will outlast the kingdoms that quarried them. The engineering marvels of Menua's reign are not limited to military architecture. Across the expanding kingdom, Eurasian engineers accomplish feats that will be remembered long after the kingdom itself has passed into legend. They carve canals through solid rock, channeling mountain streams to irrigate valleys that had never known the touch of flowing water. They tunnel through hillsides to bring springs to cities, creating water systems so sophisticated that some still function in the modern age. One of these projects captures the imagination like no other. Near the city of Van, Menua's engineers carve a canal directly through a mountain, creating a waterway nearly a mile long that connects two previously separate valley systems. The work takes decades to complete, with generations of workers following the vision of engineers who understand that the patient reshaping of the landscape can create prosperity that will endure for centuries. As you imagine this great work, picture the sound of bronze tools ringing against stone, echoing through the mountain tunnel like a heartbeat. See the workers, their faces lit by oil lamps, following a perfectly straight line through the living rock. They know that their children and their children's children will benefit from their labour, that the water flowing through this passage will nourish fields and fill cisterns long after their names are forgotten. The kingdom's prosperity during this golden age is reflected in more than just engineering projects. In the cities and towns scattered across Eurasian territory, craftsmen develop distinctive artistic styles that blend influences from across the ancient world while maintaining their own mountain character. Bronze workers create cauldrons and vessels decorated with intricate patterns of lions and eagles, gods and heroes. Jewelers work gold and silver into elaborate ornaments that speak of wealth and confidence. The Eurasian language, too, reaches its full flowering during this period. Scribes in the palace at Tushpa maintain detailed records of the kingdom's administration, recording everything from tax collections to military campaigns, from diplomatic correspondence to religious ceremonies. These tablets, written in the distinctive Eurasian adaptation of cuneiform, preserve a picture of a complex, sophisticated society that governed itself with careful attention to law and custom. Religious life under Menua becomes more elaborate and formalised. Haldi, the great god of war and mountains, is honoured with temples built on the highest peaks, accessible to human hands. These sacred places are reached by stone stairways carved into cliff faces, ascending through clouds to altitudes where the air grows thin and the voice of the god seems to whisper in the wind. But Haldi is not alone in the Eurasian pantheon. Te Sheba, god of storms and weather, is honoured with rituals that acknowledge the power of the elements in a mountain kingdom where the right wind can bring life-giving rain or devastating hail. Shivini, the sun god, receives offerings at dawn from priests who understand that in a land of long winters and short growing seasons, the warmth and light of the sun mean the difference between prosperity and starvation. The most impressive of these religious sites is established during Menua's reign at a place called Musasir, high in the mountains northeast of Lake Van. Here, a great temple complex is built around a natural amphitheatre of stone, where the very landscape seems to focus the attention of worshippers toward the sky. The Temple of Haldi at Musasir becomes a pilgrimage destination for people from across the kingdom, a place where the boundary between earth and heaven seems thin enough to cross. As the kingdom grows in power and influence, it inevitably comes into greater conflict with its ancient enemy, Assyria. But now the dynamic has changed. Where once Eurasian forces fought defensively, using the mountains to avoid direct confrontation, now they begin to take the offensive. Eurasian armies, disciplined and well-equipped, push south into regions that Assyria considers its own sphere of influence. The Assyrian response is swift and brutal. King Sargon II, one of the most formidable rulers in Assyrian history, leads multiple campaigns into Eurasian territory. His scribes record victories and burned cities, captured treasure and deported populations, but they also record something else: the stubborn resistance of a mountain people who refuse to accept defeat, who rebuild their cities and return to reclaim their lands with a persistence that wears down even Assyrian determination. Under Menua's son, Argishti I, Urartu reaches perhaps the height of its power and influence. Argishti is both warrior and builder, combining his father's vision of expansion with a practical understanding of how to consolidate and defend conquered territory. During his long reign, Urartian influence spreads further than ever before, reaching west into central Anatolia and south deep into what the Assyrians had considered their heartland. Argishti's greatest achievement is the founding of Erebuni, a fortress city built on a hill overlooking the Arax River valley. The location is chosen with the strategic insight of a ruler who understands that controlling river crossings and mountain passes is the key to controlling trade and communication across vast territories. Erebuni is built not just as a military stronghold, but as a centre of Urartian culture and administration, a city designed to demonstrate the kingdom's permanence and prosperity to all who see it. The construction of Erebuni showcases Urartian engineering at its finest. The city is built on multiple terraces carved into the hillside, with each level serving a different function. The highest terrace holds the royal palace and the temple of Haldi, their walls decorated with colourful frescoes depicting scenes of royal power and divine favour. Lower terraces contain workshops and storage areas, administrative buildings and residential quarters for the city's population. The water system of Erebuni is particularly impressive, featuring a network of channels and reservoirs that ensure the city can withstand siege conditions while maintaining the gardens and fountains that make life pleasant in peacetime. The engineers who designed this system understand that a fortress city must be not just militarily strong, but economically and socially viable if it is to serve its purpose as a permanent extension of Urartian power. Throughout this golden age, the kingdom maintains its distinctive character as a mountain civilization. Unlike the flat, river-fed empires of Mesopotamia, Urartu is essentially vertical, its cities perched on heights, its people accustomed to thinking in terms of elevation and descent. This geography shapes not just military tactics and engineering projects, but the very way Urartians think about their world. Every mountain is a temple in the Urartian worldview, every peak a sacred place where earth reaches toward heaven. Every stone has significance, every stream carries the blessings of the gods. This is a civilization that understands itself as part of the landscape rather than separate from it. A people who see their role as caretakers and shapers of the mountain realm rather than its conquerors. As Argishti's reign draws to a close, Urartu stands at the pinnacle of its achievement. From the great fortress of Tushpa on the shores of Lake Van to the new stronghold of Erebuni overlooking the Arax Valley, from the sacred heights of Musasir to the engineering marvels scattered across the kingdom's territory, Urartu has become a power that commands respect throughout the ancient world. But the mountains, patient and eternal, have seen many kingdoms reach such heights. They know, as human rulers often forget, that all heights are temporary, all power subject to the turning of seasons and the passage of time. In the wind that whistles through the peaks of Ararat, there is already the whisper of changes to come. The bronze gates of Tushpa gleam dully in the afternoon light, their surfaces marked with dents and scrapes that tell of recent battle. It is the year 714 BCE, and King Rusa I stands on the walls of his capital. watching smoke rise from the valley below, where Assyrian fires still smoulder. The great Sargon II has come north once again, bringing with him the largest army ever assembled against the mountain kingdom. For generations now, the conflict between Urartu and Assyria has been a central fact of life in the ancient Near East. Like two great storms that circle each other, neither able to completely destroy the other, but neither willing to accept the other's existence, the two kingdoms have clashed repeatedly across the borderlands that separate the Mesopotamian plains from the Armenian highlands. But this time feels different. Sargon's campaign is not merely another raid for plunder and prestige. This is a systematic attempt to break Urartu's power once and for all, to reduce the mountain kingdom to the status of a vassal state that will never again challenge Assyrian dominance in the region. The Assyrian army that spreads across the valley below Tushpa is a fearsome sight. Disciplined ranks of infantry advance behind bronze shields, their iron-tipped spears glinting in formation. Cavalry units patrol the flanks, ready to pursue any enemy force foolish enough to offer battle in open ground. Siege engines transported with enormous effort across hundreds of miles of difficult terrain begin their slow approach toward the city's walls. Yet Rusa, looking down at this display of Assyrian might, does not despair. He is the heir to generations of mountain kings who have learned that in warfare, as in engineering, patience and understanding of terrain are worth more than mere numbers. The walls of Tushpa have been strengthened and heightened since his grandfather's time. The city's water supply, drawn from deep wells and underground channels, cannot be cut off by siege. Most importantly, the surrounding mountains are filled with loyal subjects who know every path and hidden valley, every cave that might shelter a fleeing army, and every pass that might hide a surprise attack. The siege of Tushpa becomes a test of endurance rather than a quick assault. Day after day, Assyrian siege engines batter the city's walls, while Urartian defenders respond with arrows and stones, hot oil, and determined resistance. At night, small groups of Urartian warriors slip out through secret passages to attack Assyrian supply lines and outposts. The mountains themselves seem to fight against the invaders, as sudden storms sweep down from the peaks and narrow passes become traps for Assyrian patrols. But the real battle is not being fought at the walls of Tushpa. Throughout Urartian territory, a different kind of warfare is taking place. Assyrian forces spread out across the kingdom, burning cities and destroying the irrigation systems that have made the mountain valleys productive. The great canal that Menua's engineers carved through solid rock is blocked with stones. The carefully terraced fields that have fed Urartian families for generations are torn up by Assyrian ploughs. This is warfare designed not just to defeat armies, but to break the spirit of a people. Sargon understands that Urartu's strength lies not merely in its military forces, but in the patient work of generations who have shaped the mountain landscape to support a prosperous civilization. By destroying this infrastructure, he hopes to make it impossible for the Urartian kingdom to quickly recover from defeat. Yet even as cities burn and fields lie barren, the essential character of Urartu proves difficult to destroy. The mountain people fade into the high places where Assyrian armies cannot follow, taking their livestock and portable wealth with them. They emerge at night to harass enemy forces and disappear again before dawn. They use their knowledge of local terrain to turn every valley into a potential battleground, where Assyrian advantages in numbers and equipment count for little. The most significant blow comes not at Tushpa, but at the sacred city of Musasir. Sargon's forces, following intelligence provided by local informants, discover the route to the great temple complex, where Urartu's holiest treasures are kept. The assault on Musasir is swift and devastating. The Temple of Haldi, repository of centuries of offerings and symbol of Eurasian religious identity, is stripped of its gold and silver, its sacred statues carried away to Assyrian temples. News of Musasi's fall reaches Rusa at Tushpa like a physical blow. The loss of the kingdom's most sacred site is more than a military defeat. It is a spiritual catastrophe that shakes the foundations of Urartian confidence. The king's reaction, recorded by Assyrian scribes with evident satisfaction, is one of profound despair. According to their accounts, Rusa tears his clothes and retreats to his palace, refusing to meet with his advisors or make decisions about the kingdom's defence. But if the Assyrians expect this psychological victory to lead to immediate surrender, they are disappointed. The mountain kingdom proves more resilient than its king's momentary despair. Throughout Urartian territory, local commanders and regional governors continued the resistance without waiting for orders from Tushpa. The decentralised nature of Urartian administration, which allows considerable autonomy to local leaders, becomes a source of strength when central authority falters. Gradually, the tide of war begins to turn. Sargon's army, extended across hundreds of miles of hostile territory, begins to suffer from the constant harassment and the difficulty of maintaining supply lines across mountain terrain. Winter approaches and the Assyrian king faces the choice of maintaining a costly occupation force through the harsh mountain winter, or withdrawing with his objectives only partially achieved. The decision to withdraw is influenced by news from other frontiers of the Assyrian Empire. Rebellions in Babylon require immediate attention, and tribute-paying states in Syria show signs of restlessness. The resources devoted to the conquest of Urartu are needed elsewhere, and the mountain kingdom, though damaged, has proven too difficult to digest quickly. Sargon's withdrawal is not a rout, but it is not the triumphal procession he had envisioned either. Urartian forces, emerging from their mountain hideouts, harass the retreating columns and reclaim territory as soon as Assyrian garrisons are withdrawn. The great cities lie in ruins, the irrigation systems are broken, and the sacred sites have been desecrated, but the essential spirit of the kingdom remains unbroken. In the aftermath of Sargon's campaign, Rusa begins the long work of reconstruction. Cities are rebuilt, though not always in the same locations or with the same magnificence as before. The irrigation systems are restored, though the work takes years and requires the mobilization of resources from across the kingdom. Most importantly, the military organization is reformed to better cope with the realities of fighting a more powerful enemy. But even as Urartu recovers from the Assyrian onslaught, new threats begin to emerge on the northern frontiers. The Scythians, nomadic horse-riding peoples from the steppes beyond the Caucasus Mountains, begin to press southward in increasing numbers. Unlike the Assyrians, who fight in disciplined formations and seek to establish permanent control over conquered territories, the Scythians are raiders who strike swiftly and unpredictably, carrying away whatever portable wealth they can find before disappearing back into the vast grasslands. The Scythian threat poses a different kind of challenge for Urartian defenders. Against Assyrian armies, the Mountain Kingdom could use its knowledge of local terrain and its network of fortified positions to conduct an effective defensive campaign. But Scythian raiders, mounted on swift horses and unencumbered by baggage trains, can penetrate deep into Urartian territory before defenders have time to mobilise. The kingdom's response is to develop new military tactics and to strengthen its alliances with other peoples who face similar threats. Urartian forces begin to make greater use of cavalry units, recruiting both from their own population and from allied tribes who have experience in mounted warfare. Watchtower systems are extended to provide earlier warning of approaching raids, and rapid response forces are stationed at strategic points throughout the kingdom. During this period of military adaptation, Urartu also begins to experience internal political strains that further complicate its strategic situation. The costs of constant warfare and reconstruction place heavy burdens on the kingdom's resources, leading to increased taxation and mandatory labour service. Regional nobles who have grown accustomed to considerable autonomy during the kingdom's golden age begin to resist central authority when that authority demands greater sacrifices. Religious life, too, is affected by the changing circumstances. The destruction of Musasir and the loss of many sacred objects to Assyrian plunderers leads to a crisis of confidence in traditional religious practices. Some seek to restore the old ways exactly as they were, while others argue for reforms that will make Urartian religion more adaptable to changing circumstances. King Rusa himself becomes a somewhat tragic figure during these later years. Never fully recovering from the psychological impact of Sargon's invasion, he struggles to provide the kind of dynamic leadership that the kingdom needs to address its mounting challenges. His reign, which began with such promise, becomes increasingly characterized by indecision and missed opportunities. Yet even in this period of decline, Urartu continues to produce remarkable achievements. The kingdom's engineers complete new water management projects that demonstrate undiminished technical skill. Artisans create works of art that reflect both traditional Urartian themes and influences from the wider world. Scholars continue to develop the Urartian written language and to maintain detailed records of the kingdom's administration. As the 8th century BCE draws to a close, Urartu remains a significant power in the ancient Near East, but it is no longer the confident, expanding kingdom of Menua and Argishti's time. The challenges facing the mountain realm, Assyrian pressure from the south, Scythian raids from the north, internal political tensions, and the enormous costs of maintaining military readiness are beginning to strain the kingdom's resources and unity. The peaks of Ararat, eternal and patient, continue to watch over the kingdom that has taken shelter in their shadows. But the winds that blow around those peaks carry whispers of greater changes to come, changes that will test whether the mountain kingdom's foundations are strong enough to survive the storms that are gathering on all horizons. The year is 615 BCE, and the world is changing in ways that no one, not even the wisest seers in the mountain temples, could have foreseen. King Rusa III stands in the ruins of what was once the great throne room of Tushpa, watching morning light filter through gaps in the stone walls, where enemy catapults have torn away blocks that his ancestors fitted with such care. The lake beyond still stretches blue and eternal toward the horizon, but the city that once commanded its shores is a shadow of its former glory. The irony is bitter and profound. For more than 2 centuries, Urartu has struggled against the might of Assyria, sometimes winning, sometimes losing, but always enduring. The Mountain Kingdom had survived Sargon's devastating campaigns, rebuilt after Sennacherib's raids, and adapted to the constant pressure from the Mesopotamian giant. The Assyrians had been the great enemy, the threat that shaped Urartian military tactics, foreign policy, and even domestic priorities. But now Assyria itself is dying. The great empire that once seemed invincible is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions, torn apart by civil wars, rebellions, and the relentless pressure of new enemies who have learned from centuries of Assyrian warfare. In 612 BCE, just 3 years past, Nineveh itself, the proud capital of the Assyrian Empire, fell to a coalition of Babylonians and Medes. Its great palaces burned and its libraries scattered to the winds. For a brief moment, as news of Assyria's collapse spread throughout the ancient Near East, it seemed as though Urartu might benefit from the chaos. With their ancient enemy finally removed from the chessboard, the Mountain Kingdom might reclaim territories lost in previous wars, might restore the trade routes that had brought prosperity in earlier generations, might once again become a major power in the region. But the collapse of empires creates vacuums that other powers rush to fill, and Urartu discovers that the new world emerging from Assyria's ashes holds different but equally dangerous threats. The Medes, who had been instrumental in Assyria's destruction, now cast their eyes northward toward the Armenian highlands. Unlike the Assyrians, who had always seen Urartu as a troublesome but secondary concern, the Medes view control of the mountain passes and trade routes as essential to their own security and prosperity. The Median approach to conquest is different from the Assyrian model. Where Assyrian armies had relied on massive set-piece battles and siege warfare, the Medes employ more subtle tactics: bribery of local officials, support for regional rebellions, the gradual erosion of central authority rather than direct assault on fortified positions. It is a slower method, but ultimately more effective against a kingdom already weakened by centuries of warfare and internal strain. From the north, the Scythian threat continues to intensify. What had begun as occasional raids by small bands of horsemen has evolved into systematic pressure by entire tribal confederations seeking new lands to settle. The Scythians bring with them not just military skill, but a different way of life, nomadic, mobile, unattached to the fixed agricultural settlements that form the foundation of Urartian civilization. The cultural clash between the settled mountain dwellers and the nomadic raiders goes beyond mere competition for resources. The Scythians represent a fundamental challenge to the Urartian worldview, which sees human prosperity as intimately connected to specific places, to the stones of particular mountains, the waters of certain lakes, the carefully tended fields of ancestral valleys. To people who can load their entire wealth onto horseback and move it hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, the Urartian attachment to place seems not just foolish, but actively harmful. Within Urartu itself, the stresses of this multi-front challenge begin to tear at the fabric of the kingdom. Regional governors, faced with immediate threats to their own territories, increasingly make decisions without consulting the central government at Tushpa. Some negotiate separate truces with Median commanders, others hire Scythian mercenaries to defend against other Scythian raiders. Still others simply abandon their posts and flee to more secure regions. The kingdom's famous engineering infrastructure, once a source of strength and prosperity, becomes a liability in this new strategic environment. The great irrigation canals that had made mountain valleys productive are vulnerable to sabotage by raiding parties. The carefully constructed fortress cities, designed to withstand siege by Assyrian armies, prove less effective against enemies who prefer to bypass strong points and attack softer targets elsewhere. King Rusa III, inheriting this deteriorating situation, struggles to hold together a kingdom that seems to be dissolving from within as much as being conquered from without. He is not an incompetent ruler. His inscriptions and the archaeological record suggest a man who understood the challenges facing his realm and made reasonable attempts to address them. But he is a king without adequate resources, leading a people who have grown weary of constant warfare and sacrifice. The final crisis comes not with a single dramatic battle, but through a series of cascading failures that leave the kingdom unable to respond effectively to any of its challenges. A particularly severe winter kills much of the livestock that represents the mountain people's accumulated wealth. Scythian raiders, taking advantage of the weakened state of Urartian defences, penetrate deeper into the kingdom than ever before, reaching valleys that had been secure for generations. Most devastating of all, a major earthquake strikes the region around Lake Van, damaging many of the fortified cities and disrupting the water systems upon which the kingdom's agricultural productivity depends. In a stable political environment, such a disaster might have been overcome through coordinated reconstruction efforts. But in the chaos of the early 6th century BCE, it becomes the final blow that breaks Urartian resistance. The end, when it comes, is not the dramatic siege and storming that had characterised so many earlier conflicts. Instead, Tushpa is abandoned gradually, its population scattering to smaller settlements or fleeing to neighbouring kingdoms. The great palace complexes, empty of their royal occupants, slowly fall into ruin, as wind and weather do what enemy armies had never quite managed to accomplish. By 590 BCE, the kingdom of Urartu has effectively ceased to exist as an independent political entity. Some regions are absorbed into the expanding Median Empire. Others fall under the control of local strongmen who acknowledge no higher authority. The Scythians continue their raids with impunity, while the survivors of the Mountain Kingdom's population adapt as best they can to a new world where the old certainties no longer apply. A mountain kingdom crumbled, not with a great battle, but with silence. Swallowed by stone and time, its people scattered like leaves before the autumn wind, carrying with them only memories of the glory that once was. The morning mist rises from Lake Van, as it has for countless millennia, and in that mist, if you listen carefully, you can still hear the echoes of voices, speaking in a language that died with the kingdom. The year is now 550 BCE, 40 years since the last king of Urartu walked the halls of Tushpa, and the ruins of the mountain kingdom stand as silent testimony to the ambitions and achievements of a forgotten people. But forgotten is not quite the right word, for the bones of Urartu still rest in the mountains, still shape the landscape, still whisper their secrets to those who know how to listen. The great stone walls of Tushpa, though cracked by earthquake and worn by weather, still stand guard over the lake. The inscription of King Argishti, carved deep into the volcanic rock of Erebuni, still proclaims the glory of a dynasty that ruled these mountains for nearly 3 centuries. Most remarkably, the engineering marvels of the Urartian kings continue to serve the people who now call these valleys home. The canal that Menua's workers carved through solid rock still carries mountain water to irrigate fields that never knew the touch of the original builders. The terraced hillsides still hold the soil that feeds families whose ancestors may have been among those who first shaped these stone gardens from the raw material of the mountains. The language of Urartu, written in cuneiform on thousands of clay tablets and carved into stone monuments throughout the kingdom, remains largely undeciphered. Modern scholars have identified perhaps a few hundred words with reasonable confidence, but the grammar, the syntax, the subtle meanings that would unlock the literature and official records of the kingdom remain as mysterious as they were when the last native speaker drew his final breath. This linguistic mystery adds an almost magical quality to the Urartian ruins. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphics or Mesopotamian cuneiform, which yield their secrets readily to modern scholarship, Urartian inscriptions retain their silence. They speak of kings and conquests, of gods and temples, of laws and ceremonies, but they speak in a voice that we can only partially understand, like a song heard from a great distance on a mountain wind. What we do know suggests a civilization of remarkable sophistication and durability. The archaeological record reveals a people who were master engineers and skilled craftsmen, devout worshippers, and effective administrators. Their art, influenced by but distinct from the styles of their neighbours, shows a unique aesthetic sensibility that valued both power and beauty, strength and grace. The influence of Urartu did not die with the kingdom itself. Many scholars believe that the survivors of the mountain realm became part of the early Armenian people, contributing their genes, their memories, and their understanding of mountain life to the culture that would emerge in the same highlands centuries later. If this is true, then something of Urartu lives on in the Armenian language, in Armenian customs, in the Armenian relationship with the landscape of their ancestors. The religious traditions of Urartu, too, may have left traces that survived the kingdom's political collapse. The worship of Haldi, the warrior god who stood atop lions, bears similarities to later traditions in the region. The sacred places of the mountain kingdom, the high peaks where temples were built, the caves where offerings were made, the springs that were blessed by priests, retained their sanctity for generations after the last Urartian ceremony was performed. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Urartu is not in any specific cultural transmission, but in the simple fact that they proved it was possible to create and maintain a sophisticated civilization in one of the world's most challenging environments. The Armenian highlands, with their harsh winters and short growing seasons, their volcanic soil and steep slopes, their isolation from the great trade routes of the ancient world, might seem an unlikely place for a great kingdom to flourish. Yet for nearly 3 centuries, Urartu demonstrated that human ingenuity and determination could overcome even the most daunting geographical obstacles. They showed that mountains could be not just barriers but foundations, that isolation could be not just a weakness but a strength, that a people who truly understood their environment could create prosperity even in the most unlikely places. The story of Urartu reminds us that history is not just a record of empires that conquered and cultures that dominated, but also of peoples who adapted and endured. In a world that often celebrates only the largest and most powerful, the Mountain Kingdom stands as a testament to the achievements possible when human communities work in harmony with their natural environment rather than in opposition to it. Today, the ruins of Urartian cities attract archaeologists and tourists from around the world, people drawn by the mystery of a civilization that left so many questions unanswered. They climb the stone steps that Urartian pilgrims once ascended to reach their temples. They walk through the remains of palaces where kings once held court. They stand on fortress walls and look out over valleys that once echoed with the sounds of a living, thriving culture. And sometimes, in the quiet moments when the wind dies down and the only sound is the distant lapping of waves against the shore of Lake Van, visitors report that they can almost hear something, a whisper, a sigh, the ghost of voices speaking in a language that no one remembers. Whether this is imagination or something more, it speaks to the power of places to hold memory, to preserve something of the human stories that once unfolded within their boundaries. The peaks of Ararat still rise against the sky as they did when the first Urartian king looked upon them and decided that these mountains would be the foundation of a kingdom. They have watched the rise and fall of many people since then, but they remember Urartu, preserve its ruins, guard its secrets with the patience that only mountains possess. The mist is gathering now around the peaks of Ararat, as it has every evening for countless thousands of years. The lake grows dark and still, reflecting the first stars that appear in the deepening sky. Somewhere in the ruins of Tushpa, a stone settles with a soft sound that might be a sigh, might be the whisper of wind through empty halls where kings once walked. Empires rise like flame and fall like dust, but the mountains endure. The Assyrians, who seemed so mighty and permanent, are gone now, their great cities buried under centuries of sand and neglect. The Medes, who inherited their power, gave way in turn to Persians, who yielded to Greeks, who were conquered by Romans, who eventually crumbled into the foundations of other civilizations whose names we remember only dimly. But here, in the highlands where east meets west and ancient meets eternal, something of Urartu still lives. It lives in the stones that still stand, fitted so perfectly that no mortar was needed. It lives in the channels that still carry water from mountain springs to valley fields. It lives in the inscriptions that still wait for someone clever enough to unlock their meaning, in the ruins that still shelter travellers from mountain storms, in the memories that still echo in the wind that blows around the peaks. The people of Urartu understood something that many civilizations forget, that true permanence comes not from conquering the world, but from understanding your place within it. They built not for glory alone, but for the generations who would come after them. They carved their kingdom not just into stone, but into the very landscape itself, making themselves part of the mountains they called home. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and your breathing slows, let the stones of that ancient kingdom whisper you to sleep. Let the wind through the mountain passes carry you gently into dreams. Let the patient peaks of Ararat watch over your rest, as they once watched over a kingdom that knew how to build for eternity. In the quiet darkness, you can almost hear them, the voices of stonemasons and engineers, of priests and kings, of ordinary people who lived and loved and worked in a mountain realm that time has not quite forgotten. They speak in a language you cannot understand, but their message is clear, that human hands can create beauty that outlasts empires, that human hearts can find home even in the most unlikely places, that human dreams can take root in stone and grow into something that the centuries cannot destroy. Sleep now, and let the ancient kingdom cradle your dreams. Let the memory of Urartu, gentle and strong, carry you safely through the night until the dawn brings you back to your own world, your own time, your own mountains to climb. The peaks of Ararat keep their eternal watch, and all is well in the kingdom of sleep. Hello there, welcome to Whispered Ages. Before we begin our journey through time together, I'd love to know how your day has been treating you. Whether it's morning coffee time, an afternoon break, or perhaps you're settling in for the evening, wherever you are in this vast world of ours, you've found the perfect moment to step back into history. If you're enjoying these stories from the past, please consider subscribing to Whispered Ages for more tales of civilizations lost and found. Tonight, we travel to the highlands of ancient Anatolia, to a people whose very name was forgotten by time itself. This is the story of the Hittites, an empire that once stood shoulder to shoulder with the pharaohs of Egypt, yet vanished so completely that for 3,000 years they existed only as mysterious references in ancient texts. Settle in as we uncover the rise and fall of one of history's most remarkable forgotten empires, Central Anatolia, circa 1700 to 1400 BCE. The morning mist clung to the valleys of Central Anatolia as Labana I stood atop the hill that would one day hold the mighty walls of Hattusa. Below him stretched a landscape of scattered settlements, each jealously guarding its independence, each vulnerable to the raiders who swept down from the northern mountains or up from the southern plains. But Labarna saw something different in this fractured land. He saw unity waiting to be born. The year was approximately 1680 BCE, and the world was a tapestry of emerging powers. In the south, the great cities of Mesopotamia continued their ancient dance of conquest and commerce. To the southwest, Egypt was entering a period of unprecedented wealth and expansion. But here, in the Anatolian highlands, something new was stirring. Labarna was not originally from these lands. His people, the Hittites, were part of the great migration of Indo-European speakers who had been spreading across the ancient world for centuries. They had arrived in Anatolia to find an established people called the Hatti, skilled in metalwork and blessed with knowledge of the local terrain. Rather than simply conquering and displacing these indigenous people, the Hittites did something remarkable for the ancient world. They adapted. The fusion was not immediate, nor was it always peaceful. Villages burned, warriors fell, and families fled in the darkness of night. But gradually, through a combination of military prowess and cultural flexibility, the Hittites began to absorb Hattian customs, gods, and even administrative practices. They learned to work the iron deposits that were scattered throughout their mountain homeland, developing techniques that gave them weapons superior to the bronze implements used by most of their contemporaries. Labarna's genius lay not just in his ability to conquer, but in his capacity to organise. Where previous warlords had been content to raid and retreat, he established permanent garrisons. Where others had ruled through fear alone, he offered incentives for loyalty. Craftsmen who submitted to his rule found their skills valued and their workshops protected. Merchants discovered that the roads under Hittite control were safer than they had been in generations. The process of unification took decades. City-states that had maintained their independence for centuries did not surrender easily. The siege of Purushanda lasted 3 years, with both sides employing every technique of ancient warfare. Great earthworks were raised, undermining operations carved secret tunnels beneath defensive walls, and the latest innovations in siege engines were deployed. When the city finally fell, Labarna made another decision that would characterise Hittite rule for centuries to come. Rather than destroying Purushanda utterly, he incorporated its surviving defenders into his own army and its craftsmen into his growing administrative apparatus. By 1650 BCE, the basic structure of what would become the Hittite Empire was taking shape. Hattusa, the capital, was growing from a modest hilltop settlement into a proper city. The location had been chosen with care. Situated on defensible high ground, but close to important trade routes, it commanded the surrounding valleys, while remaining accessible to merchants and diplomats. The earliest palace complex was modest by later standards, but it already displayed the architectural innovation that would become a Hittite trademark. The Hittites were quick to adopt and adapt technologies from their neighbours. From Mesopotamia, they learned the art of cuneiform writing, though they adapted it to record their own Indo-European language. From the Assyrians, they acquired techniques for training horses and manufacturing chariots, but in each case they improved upon what they learnt. Hittite chariots were lighter and more manoeuvrable than their Mesopotamian counterparts. Their cuneiform tablets, when archaeologists finally deciphered them millennia later, revealed a more sophisticated legal system than existed in most contemporary societies. The reign of Hattusili I, Labarna's successor, marked the true emergence of the Hittites as a regional power. Where Labarna had focused primarily on unifying the Anatolian highlands, Hattusili looked beyond the traditional boundaries of Hittite territory. His armies pushed south into Syria, bringing them into contact with the established powers of the ancient Near East for the first time. The Syrian campaigns were brutal affairs. Cities that had prospered under Mesopotamian protection suddenly found themselves facing warriors who fought with iron weapons and moved with a speed that Bronze Age armies had never encountered. Al-Lalak fell after a siege that lasted only 2 months. Babylon itself, the ancient seat of Hammurabi's empire, trembled as Hittite scouts were reported within a day's march of its walls. But Hattusili's ambitions ultimately exceeded his resources. The supply line stretching from Anatolia to Syria proved vulnerable to attack, and maintaining garrisons in conquered territories strained the kingdom's manpower. After several years of costly campaigns, a compromise was reached. The Hittites would retain control of key strategic points in northern Syria, but they would not attempt to hold territory deep in Mesopotamia. This early phase of expansion taught the Hittites lessons that would serve them well in later centuries. They learned the importance of diplomacy as well as military might. They discovered that ruling conquered peoples required different skills than conquering them. Most importantly, they developed the administrative systems that would allow them to govern an empire stretching across multiple cultures and languages. The kingdom that emerged from these early centuries of growth was unlike anything else in the ancient world. At its heart was Hattusa, now protected by massive stone walls and gates that represented some of the finest military architecture of the Bronze Age. The famous Lion Gate, with its carved stone guardians, proclaimed Hittite power to anyone approaching the capital. Within the walls, a complex of palaces, temples, and administrative buildings housed the growing bureaucracy that governed Hittite territories. The Hittite army of this period was perhaps the most technologically advanced force in the ancient world. Their mastery of ironworking gave them superior weapons, while their innovations in chariot design provided them with unprecedented mobility on the battlefield. But technology alone did not account for their success. The Hittites developed tactical innovations that maximized the effectiveness of their equipment. Their chariots were used not as individual fighting platforms, as was common elsewhere, but as coordinated units that could execute complex maneuvers on the battlefield. Perhaps most remarkably, the Hittites were among the first ancient peoples to develop what we might recognize as professional diplomatic corps. As their territory expanded and they came into contact with more established powers, they discovered that negotiation could often achieve what military force could not. Hittite kings began to correspond regularly with their counterparts in Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. These letters, preserved on cuneiform tablets, reveal a sophisticated understanding of international relations. The religious life of the Hittites during this period reflected their cultural adaptability. Rather than imposing their own gods upon conquered peoples, they added local deities to their pantheon. The result was a religious system of remarkable complexity, with over 1,000 gods receiving official recognition. This religious tolerance was not mere pragmatism, though practical considerations certainly played a role. The Hittites genuinely believed that gods were tied to specific places and peoples, and that conquering a territory meant assuming responsibility for its spiritual well-being as well as its material prosperity. By 1400 BCE, the foundations of what would become one of the ancient world's great empires were firmly in place. The Hittites had transformed themselves from a collection of tribal peoples into a sophisticated state capable of projecting power across vast distances. Their capital at Hattusa rivaled any city in the ancient world for its architectural grandeur and administrative complexity. Their army was feared from the shores of the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt. But the true test of Hittite power lay ahead. The second millennium BCE was entering its most turbulent period, as established empires clashed for dominance and new peoples pressed against the borders of civilization. The Hittites had built a strong foundation, but whether it could support the weight of empire remained to be seen. The height of Hittite power, circa 1400 to 1250 BCE. The sun was setting behind the walls of Hattusa when King Suppiluliuma I received the most extraordinary diplomatic communication of his reign. The message, written in Akkadian on a clay tablet, bore the seal of the Egyptian royal house, but this was no ordinary diplomatic correspondence between equals. This was a letter from Ankhesenamun, the young widow of Tutankhamun, pleading with the Hittite king to send one of his sons to marry her and rule Egypt. "My husband has died," the letter read, "and I have no sons. They say I should marry one of my servants, but I refuse. Send me one of your sons, and he shall be my husband and rule over Egypt." Suppiluliuma stared at the tablet in amazement. Never in the history of Egypt had a pharaoh's widow offered the throne to a foreign prince. The implications were staggering. With a single marriage alliance, the Hittites could potentially control both their own empire and the wealth of the Nile Valley. It was an opportunity beyond the wildest dreams of his predecessors. But it was also, Suppiluliuma realised, almost certainly a trap. This moment, occurring around 1323 BCE, perfectly captures the complexity of international relations during the height of the Hittite Empire. By this time, the Hittites had evolved far beyond their origins as Anatolian highlanders. They had become one of the four great powers of the late Bronze Age world, standing as equals with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria in a complex web of diplomacy, trade, and warfare that spanned the known world. The rise to this position had not been easy or inevitable. After the foundational work of Labana and Hattusili, the Hittite kingdom had endured a century of internal strife and external pressure. Succession disputes had weakened royal authority, while aggressive neighbours had seized Hittite territories. For a time it seemed possible that the Hittites might collapse entirely, becoming merely another footnote in the long history of Anatolian peoples. The recovery had begun under Tudaliya I, who had spent decades fighting to restore Hittite power, but it was under Suppiluliuma that the kingdom had truly been transformed into an empire. Taking the throne around 1344 BCE, he had combined military genius with diplomatic skill to expand Hittite influence further than ever before. His first major campaign had targeted the kingdom of Mitanni, which controlled much of northern Syria and had long been a rival for influence in the region. The Mitannians were formidable opponents, skilled in chariot warfare and backed by Egyptian gold. Their capital at Washukani was protected by elaborate fortifications and had never fallen to foreign assault. Suppiluliuma's approach to this challenge demonstrated the sophistication that Hittite warfare had achieved. Rather than attempting a direct assault on Mitannian strongholds, he first isolated them diplomatically. Secret negotiations with Mitannian vassals had revealed widespread dissatisfaction with their overlords. Heavy tribute demands and arbitrary rule had created numerous potential allies for the Hittites. The campaign itself was a masterpiece of strategic coordination. While Hittite armies engaged Mitannian forces in northern Syria, other units crossed the Euphrates far to the east, threatening the Mitannian heartland. Supply lines were carefully planned to ensure that Hittite forces could maintain their offensive for months, if necessary. Most importantly, local populations were treated as potential allies rather than conquered peoples. The decisive battle had occurred near the city of Carchemish in 1340 BCE. The Mitannians, forced to fight on multiple fronts, had gathered their strength for a final confrontation. Their army was magnificent, with hundreds of bronze-armoured chariots, arranged in perfect formation, their horses prancing beneath banners that had flown over Syrian battlefields for generations. The Hittite force that faced them represented the culmination of centuries of military evolution. Their chariots were lighter and more manoeuvrable than their opponents. Their iron weapons gave individual warriors a crucial advantage, and their tactical coordination was superior to anything the Mitannians had encountered. But perhaps most importantly, they fought with the confidence of soldiers who knew they represented a rising power, while their enemies faced the spectre of inevitable decline. The battle lasted from dawn until late afternoon. Chariot charges thundered across the plain, raising clouds of dust that obscured the sun. Infantry formations clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat, while archers sought elevated positions from which to rain death upon their enemies. When the dust finally settled, Mitannian power in Syria had been broken forever. But Suppiluliuma's true genius lay not in his ability to win battles, but in his capacity to consolidate victories. Rather than attempting to rule conquered territories directly from distant Hattusa, he established a system of client kingdoms ruled by local dynasties that owed allegiance to the Hittite crown. This approach required careful management and constant diplomatic attention, but it allowed the Hittites to control vast territories with relatively small numbers of troops. The success of this system was demonstrated in the aftermath of the Mitannian conquest. Several Syrian city-states that had been Mitannian vassals voluntarily submitted to Hittite overlordship, calculating that the Hittites would prove more benevolent masters than their predecessors. The transition was not without violence, but it was far less destructive than it might have been if the Hittites had attempted to impose direct rule. This expansion brought the Hittites into direct confrontation with Egypt, which had long considered Syria to be within its sphere of influence. The Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep III had watched Hittite expansion with growing alarm, but his own kingdom was entering a period of internal turmoil that limited his ability to respond effectively. His son and successor, Akhenaten, was more interested in religious reform than foreign policy, allowing Hittite influence in Syria to grow unchecked. It was during this period of Egyptian weakness that Ankhesenamun's extraordinary letter had arrived. Suppiluliuma's advisors were divided on how to respond. Some argued that the opportunity was too great to ignore, that control of Egypt would make the Hittites masters of the entire ancient world. Others warned that the offer was almost certainly a trap, designed to lure a Hittite prince to his death and provide Egypt with a casus belli for war against the Hittites. After months of deliberation, Suppiluliuma made his decision. He would send his son Zananza to Egypt, but with a small escort and careful instructions to retreat immediately if the situation appeared dangerous. The gamble was enormous, but the potential rewards justified the risk. The plan ended in disaster. Zananza and his escort were murdered while travelling through Syrian territory, possibly by Egyptian agents, possibly by bandits who had no idea of the political significance of their victims. The young prince's death made war between the Hittites and Egypt inevitable. The conflict that followed was unlike anything the ancient world had ever seen. Both empires committed unprecedented resources to the struggle, recognizing that the outcome would determine the balance of power in the Near East for generations to come. Egyptian armies marched north through Palestine and Syria, while Hittite forces moved south from their strongholds in Anatolia. The decisive confrontation came in 1274 BCE at the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River. By this time, Suppiluliuma was dead, and the Hittite forces were commanded by his son, Muwatalli II. The Egyptian army was led by the young pharaoh Ramses II, who had staked his entire reign on achieving a decisive victory over the Hittites. The armies that faced each other at Kadesh represented the pinnacle of Bronze Age military technology. The Egyptians had assembled the largest force in their history, with over 20,000 infantry and nearly 3,000 chariots. Their equipment was magnificent, with bronze weapons polished to mirror brightness, and chariots decorated with gold and precious stones. Ramses himself rode in a chariot that was said to be worth more than entire cities. The Hittite army was smaller, but more experienced. Muwatalli had learned from his father's campaigns and had refined Hittite tactics to achieve maximum effectiveness. His chariots were arranged in units that could operate independently or coordinate for large-scale manoeuvres. His infantry included both regular troops and contingents from allied kingdoms, creating a force that was both diverse and unified in purpose. The battle itself was a testament to the complexity of ancient warfare. It began before dawn with skirmishing between advance units, escalated into a series of massive chariot charges that shook the earth and culminated in a confused melee that lasted until sunset. Both sides displayed remarkable courage and skill, and both suffered devastating casualties. When the fighting ended, neither side could claim a clear victory. The Egyptians had failed to break Hittite power, but the Hittites had been unable to drive the Egyptians from Syria entirely. Both armies had been so badly mauled that continuing the campaign was impossible. As night fell over the battlefield of Kadesh, it was clear that the war had reached a stalemate. The aftermath of Kadesh demonstrated the sophistication that ancient diplomacy had achieved. Rather than continuing a destructive conflict that neither side could win decisively, Muwatalli and Ramses began negotiations for a comprehensive peace treaty. The process took years and involved some of the finest diplomatic minds of the ancient world. The Treaty of Kadesh, signed in 1259 BCE, was a masterpiece of international law. It established clear boundaries between Egyptian and Hittite spheres of influence, created mechanisms for resolving future disputes, and even included provisions for mutual defence against common enemies. Most remarkably, it was recorded in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hittite cuneiform, ensuring that both sides understood their obligations precisely. The treaty ushered in a period of unprecedented cooperation between the two empires. Trade flourished along routes that had been battlefields only years before. Cultural exchange reached new heights, with Egyptian artists working in Hittite courts and Hittite craftsmen finding markets in Egyptian cities. The marriage of a Hittite princess to Ramses II symbolised the transformation of former enemies into allies. This period of peace allowed both empires to focus on internal development and the challenges posed by other enemies. For the Hittites, the most pressing concerns came from the west, where new peoples were pressing against the established order. The Mycenaean Greeks had begun expanding their influence in western Anatolia, while mysterious raiders from the sea were threatening coastal settlements. The Hittites responded to these challenges with their characteristic combination of military force and diplomatic skill. Treaties were negotiated with Greek kingdoms that established clear boundaries and trading relationships. Coastal defences were strengthened, and naval forces were developed to counter seaborne raiders. The Great Archive at Hattusa from this period reveals a diplomatic correspondence that spanned the known world from the Greek islands to the borders of India. But perhaps the most significant development of this period was the evolution of Hittite administrative systems. Governing an empire that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of Egypt required unprecedented organisational sophistication. The Hittites developed legal codes that balanced local customs with imperial requirements, created tax systems that funded imperial administration without crushing local economies, and established communication networks that allowed rapid coordination across vast distances. The religious life of the empire also reached new heights of complexity during this period. The Hittite pantheon had grown to include over 1,000 deities, reflecting the empire's cultural diversity. Great festivals brought together worshippers from across the empire, creating a sense of shared identity that transcended local loyalties. The rock sanctuary at Yazilakaya, with its magnificent reliefs depicting the entire Hittite pantheon, represented the artistic and spiritual culmination of this religious synthesis. By 1250 BCE, the Hittite Empire had achieved a level of power and sophistication that rivaled anything in the ancient world. Its armies were feared and respected from the Aegean to the Euphrates. Its diplomats were welcome in courts from Memphis to Babylon. Its merchants carried Hittite goods and ideas to the furthest corners of the civilized world. But beneath this magnificent facade, subtle signs of stress were beginning to appear. The empire's very success had created new vulnerabilities that would prove difficult to address. The complex administrative systems that governed distant territories required enormous resources to maintain. The diplomatic balancing act that kept potential enemies at bay demanded constant attention from the imperial court. Most ominously, changes in climate and population movements were creating pressures that would soon test the empire's resilience to its limits. The height of Hittite power was magnificent to behold, but like all human achievements, it carried within itself the seeds of its own eventual decline. The final century, circa 1250 to 1178 BCE. The first signs of trouble came not from enemy armies or diplomatic crises, but from the sky itself. In the 13th century BCE, the climate of the eastern Mediterranean began to shift in ways that would have catastrophic consequences for the civilizations that had flourished there for over 1,000 years. Rains that had fallen reliably for generations began to fail. Rivers that had never been known to run dry became seasonal streams. The great granaries of Hattusa, once symbols of Hittite prosperity, stood increasingly empty as harvest dwindled year after year. King Tudhaliya IV stood on the walls of his capital city in the year 1220 BCE, looking out over fields that should have been golden with grain, but instead stretched brown and barren to the horizon. The reports from his governors throughout the empire told the same story. In the coastal regions, fishing yields were declining as marine ecosystems shifted. In the mountain valleys, herds that had sustained communities for centuries were dying of starvation. Across the empire, populations were beginning to move, seeking new sources of food and water. The Hittites had faced military challenges before and had overcome them through superior organisation and battlefield skill. They had navigated complex diplomatic crises through careful negotiation and strategic compromise. But this new challenge was different. No army could defeat a changing climate. No treaty could restore failed rains, and no administrative system could create food where none existed. The empire's response to the crisis revealed both its strengths and its fatal weaknesses. The efficient communication networks that connected Hattusa to distant provinces quickly brought word of local famines to the imperial court. The sophisticated bureaucracy that governed the empire rapidly organised relief efforts, moving stored grain from regions that had been spared to those suffering from crop failures. The diplomatic corps that maintained relations with neighbouring powers negotiated agreements to import grain from Egypt and Mesopotamia. For a time, these measures seemed adequate. The empire's accumulated wealth allowed it to purchase food from abroad. Its administrative efficiency ensured that relief supplies reached those who needed them most urgently. But as the climate crisis deepened and spread, even these considerable resources proved insufficient. The social contract that bound the Hittite Empire together had always been based on the state's ability to provide security and prosperity to its subjects. In exchange for taxes and military service, the empire offered protection from external enemies and access to trade networks that brought wealth and exotic goods to even remote provinces. But as harvests failed and trade declined, this fundamental bargain began to break down. The first rebellions began in the outer provinces, where imperial control had always been lightest and local loyalties strongest. Syrian vassal kingdoms that had accepted Hittite overlordship during times of prosperity began to question why they should continue paying tribute to a distant capital when their own people were starving. The garrisons that enforced imperial authority were themselves affected by food shortages, and their loyalty became increasingly uncertain. Tudalia's attempts to maintain control of these distant territories stretched imperial resources to the breaking point. Military expeditions to suppress rebellions required enormous quantities of supplies that the empire could no longer spare. The soldiers who marched to restore order in Syria or western Anatolia had to be fed, and their absence from the imperial heartland left other regions vulnerable to attack or rebellion. The king found himself facing an impossible strategic dilemma. If he concentrated his forces to maintain control of the most valuable provinces, other regions would slip away from imperial control. If he spread his armies thinly to maintain a presence throughout the empire, none would be strong enough to deal with serious challenges. Each decision created new vulnerabilities, and each success in one region seemed to be balanced by failures elsewhere. The external pressures facing the empire were equally daunting. The same climate changes that were devastating Hittite territories were affecting peoples throughout the eastern Mediterranean and beyond. Populations that had maintained stable agricultural communities for generations were being forced to migrate in search of new homes. Some of these migrants were absorbed peacefully into existing communities, but others formed armed groups that threatened established settlements. The most dangerous of these population movements involved the mysterious peoples whom ancient sources called the Sea Peoples. Modern scholars still debate their origins and exact identity, but their impact on Bronze Age civilization was unmistakable. They appeared suddenly in the archaeological record around 1200 BCE, spreading destruction from the Aegean to the Levant. Their attacks were not random raids, but coordinated campaigns that suggested sophisticated organisation and clear strategic objectives. The Sea People's methods of warfare were unlike anything the established powers had encountered. They combined naval mobility with land-based tactics, allowing them to strike suddenly at coastal settlements and then disappear before defensive forces could respond. Their equipment and fighting techniques suggested influences from multiple cultures, indicating that they were not a single ethnic group but rather a confederation of displaced peoples united by desperation and opportunity. When the Sea Peoples first appeared in waters off the Hittite coast, Tudalia's initial response was to treat them as just another group of raiders who could be dealt with through conventional military action. Coastal fortifications were strengthened, naval patrols were increased, and diplomatic warnings were sent to neighbouring kingdoms about the new threat. But as reports of Sea People's activities accumulated, it became clear that this was no ordinary challenge. The attackers seemed to have detailed knowledge of local conditions and defensive arrangements. Their raids were timed to coincide with local harvest seasons, when defensive forces were dispersed and storehouses were full. Most disturbing of all, they appeared to have allies or sympathisers within some of the communities they attacked. Fortified positions that should have been impregnable fell with suspicious ease, and enemy forces seemed to have advanced knowledge of defensive plans. The growing realisation that the empire faced enemies, both within and without, created a climate of suspicion and paranoia that further weakened imperial cohesion. Local governors found their loyalty questioned by the imperial court, while the court itself became convinced that treachery was everywhere. Tudalia instituted harsh measures to ensure loyalty, but these often had the opposite effect, driving previously loyal subjects into active opposition. The crisis reached its climax during the final years of Tudalia's reign. A confederation of sea peoples and displaced Anatolian tribes launched a coordinated assault on the Hittite heartland itself. Unlike previous attacks on distant provinces, this strike threatened the very core of imperial power. The attackers demonstrated sophisticated intelligence about Hittite defensive arrangements and struck at precisely the moment when the imperial army was dispersed on multiple fronts. The siege of Hattusa that followed was unlike anything in the city's long history. Previous attacks had been brief affairs, quickly repelled by the city's formidable defences, but this assault was sustained and methodical, clearly planned by commanders who understood both the strengths and weaknesses of Hittite fortifications. The attackers established permanent camps around the city and began a systematic campaign to starve the defenders into submission. Inside the walls, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The population, that had swelled with refugees from the surrounding countryside, quickly exhausted stored food supplies. Disease spread through overcrowded districts, and civil order began to break down. Most ominously, reports reached the king that some of his own nobles were secretly negotiating with the besiegers, seeking to preserve their own positions in whatever regime might emerge from the empire's collapse. The exact details of Hattusa's final days remain mysterious. Archaeological evidence shows that the city was systematically burned sometime around 1180 BCE, but whether this destruction was carried out by foreign invaders or by the inhabitants themselves remains unclear. The royal archives were deliberately destroyed, suggesting that someone wanted to ensure that the empire's secrets died with it. The great temples were stripped of their treasures, and the massive fortifications that had protected the city for centuries were systematically dismantled. What is certain is that when the destruction ended, the Hittite Empire had ceased to exist. The administrative systems that had governed territories from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean collapsed almost overnight. The trade networks that had carried Hittite goods throughout the ancient world were severed. The diplomatic correspondence that had connected Hattusa to courts throughout the known world simply stopped. The disappearance of the Hittites was so complete that within a few generations their very existence had been largely forgotten. The territories they had ruled were occupied by new peoples who had no memory of previous rulers. The languages they had spoken ceased to be written and eventually died out entirely. The gods they had worshipped were replaced by new deities who commanded the loyalty of new populations. Some survivors undoubtedly escaped the general catastrophe. Small Hittite kingdoms persisted in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria for several more centuries, maintaining some memory of the great empire's traditions. But these were pale shadows of the former imperial glory, local principalities that bore little resemblance to the great power that had once challenged Egypt and Babylon. The speed and completeness of the Hittite collapse has puzzled historians for decades. How could an empire that had survived for centuries, that had overcome numerous military and diplomatic challenges, disappear so suddenly and thoroughly? The answer seems to lie in the combination of environmental crisis, social breakdown, and external pressure that overwhelmed the empire's adaptive capacity. The Hittites had built their power on their ability to respond flexibly to changing circumstances. Their military innovations had allowed them to defeat more established powers. Their diplomatic skill had enabled them to manage complex international relationships. Their administrative efficiency had permitted them to govern diverse populations across vast territories. But all of these adaptations had been responses to political and military challenges. When faced with environmental changes that undermined the fundamental basis of their society, the empire's sophisticated systems proved inadequate. The climate crisis had not only reduced the empire's economic resources, but had also triggered population movements that destabilized the entire region. The administrative systems that had efficiently governed stable populations proved unable to cope with massive refugee movements and social upheaval. The military forces that had defeated organised armies were less effective against the guerrilla tactics employed by desperate migrants. The diplomatic networks that had maintained peaceful relations between established kingdoms could not function when those kingdoms themselves were collapsing. Perhaps most fatally, the empire's very success had created vulnerabilities that became critical weaknesses during the crisis. The concentration of wealth and population in major cities like Hattusa had created magnificent centres of civilization, but it had also created targets that were difficult to defend and catastrophic to lose. The efficient communication systems that had allowed rapid coordination across the empire also meant that bad news and panic could spread just as quickly as administrative orders. The cultural synthesis that had united diverse peoples under Hittite rule proved fragile when the empire could no longer deliver the prosperity and security that had made that unity attractive. By 1178 BCE, the last vestiges of Hittite imperial power had vanished. The great gates of Hattusa stood empty, their carved lions gazing out over abandoned streets. The cuneiform tablets that recorded the empire's laws, treaties, and administrative decisions lay buried under the rubble of collapsed buildings. The very memory of the people who had once ruled from the Aegean to the Euphrates began its long journey into oblivion. For over 3,000 years, the Hittites would remain forgotten, remembered only in scattered references in biblical texts and Egyptian inscriptions. Their magnificent capital would become a ruin of stones whose builders were unknown. Their language would become an archaeological puzzle waiting for scholars who would not be born for millennia. Their empire would become one of history's greatest lost civilizations, waiting for rediscovery by minds that could barely imagine the world in which they had flourished. The archaeological renaissance, 19th to 20th century CE. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barren hills of central Anatolia as Charles Texier guided his horse along the ancient caravan route that wound through the valley below Boiscalais. It was March 1834, and the French archaeologist was nearing the end of a long journey through the Ottoman Empire, documenting ancient ruins and making notes for the scholarly papers he hoped would establish his reputation back in Paris. He had already visited the better-known sites around Ankara and was now exploring the more remote regions where local villagers spoke of old stones and mysterious carvings. what Texier discovered that day would eventually revolutionize our understanding of the ancient world, though he himself had no idea of the significance of his find. Scattered across the hillsides were massive stone blocks, clearly the remains of ancient fortifications. Gates carved with strange figures stood partially buried in centuries of accumulated soil. Most intriguingly, fragments of inscribed stones bore writing in an unknown script that bore no resemblance to any ancient language Texier recognised. The local villagers called the ruins Boaz Kale, or Gorge Castle, but they had no memory of who had built these massive structures. Turkish and Kurdish families had lived in the region for centuries, but their oral traditions contain no stories about the ancient builders. The ruins were simply part of the landscape, useful primarily as sources of building stone for more recent construction projects. Texier made careful drawings of what he saw and collected samples of the inscribed stones, but he left Boaz Kale with more questions than answers. His subsequent publications described the ruins as possibly belonging to the ancient city of Tavium, mentioned by Roman authors as a Galatian settlement. It was a reasonable guess based on the limited information available, but it was completely wrong. The ruins that Texier had documented were far older and far more significant than anyone in the 19th century could have imagined. For the next 70 years, the ruins at Boaz Kale remained an archaeological puzzle. Other travellers visited the site and added their own observations, but no one could definitively identify the builders or decipher the mysterious inscriptions. Some scholars suggested connections to the Assyrians or Babylonians, while others proposed that the ruins were Roman or Byzantine. The strange hieroglyphic writing found on some stones was particularly puzzling, resembling Egyptian hieroglyphs in some ways, but clearly representing a different language entirely. The breakthrough came in 1906 when Hugo Winkler arrived at Boaz Kale and began excavating. His team immediately uncovered thousands of cuneiform tablets in royal archives. These tablets revealed diplomatic correspondence between Hittite rulers and the pharaohs of Egypt, proving this was no minor kingdom but a great empire. The tablets contained copies of the Treaty of Kadesh between the Hittites and Ramses II, the same treaty found in Egyptian temples. Scholars realized they had rediscovered one of the ancient world's four great powers. The mysterious Hittites mentioned in the Bible had been lost for 3,000 years. Excavations revealed Hattusa's true magnificence: 6 kilometres of fortification walls, massive palace complexes, and advanced architecture rivaling any ancient civilization. In 1915, Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný deciphered the Hittite language, proving it was Indo-European and the oldest of its language family. The discoveries revolutionized Bronze Age history. The Hittites weren't just another forgotten people, but master diplomats who maintained correspondence across the known world. Their legal system protected women and slaves in unprecedented ways. Their religious tolerance created a pantheon of over 1,000 gods. Their iron technology and chariot innovations gave them military superiority. Modern excavations continue revealing new aspects of their sophisticated civilization. Advanced metallurgy, complex agriculture, and extensive trade networks paint a picture of remarkable achievement. The Hittites pioneered diplomatic practices still used today and demonstrated how cultural diversity could strengthen rather than weaken an empire. From Labana's first dreams of unity in Anatolia to Suppiluliuma's correspondence with Egyptian queens, from the burning of Hattusa to Winkler's excavations, the Hittite story spans 3 millennia. They achieved immortality through rediscovery, proving that even the most complete historical defeats aren't final. Today, the Lions of Hattusa still guard their gates as tourists and scholars pay homage to the forgotten empire that is forgotten no more. Their legacy lives on in museums worldwide, ensuring these remarkable people will never again disappear from human memory. The Hittites remind us that history is never truly finished, that every generation must rediscover the past, and that the ancient world still holds surprises for those who seek them. The Whispered Ages have given up their secrets. The Hittites have reclaimed their rightful place among the great civilizations of antiquity, teaching us that human ambition and achievement can survive even the deepest oblivion. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time with Whispered Ages.